Hello, and welcome to Preserving Sensitive Data in Distributed Digital Storage Networks. My name is Sibyl Schaefer. I am the Chronopolis Program Manager at the University of California, San Diego, and I'll be discussing an IMLS planning grant on establishing the framework for a distributed digital preservation system for sensitive and private data. My co-leads on this grant are Courtney Mumma, the Deputy Director of the Texas Digital Library, or TDL, and Christy Park, the Executive Director of TDL. Both TDL and the UCSD Library have established business models and years of experience building and providing distributed digital preservation services, or DDP services, as well as a history of collaborating with one another on these services. UCSD manages the internationally recognized DDP service, Chronopolis, which spans 3 sites across the United States and is one of the earliest established DDP services in the world. TDL is a consortium which provides a number of services supporting digital libraries and has offered DDP storage services since 2015. TDL became a replicating node for Chronopolis just a few years ago. And both TDL and the UCSD Library maintain close working relationships with data centers affiliated with our home institutions that can provide key resources for a DDP service for sensitive data. This grant developed out of the recognition that academic health science libraries especially face a growing backlog of digital private health information, or PHI, that's governed by HIPAA. HIPAA is a US federal law that basically states a person's health information must be kept in a secure manner. Additionally, university-held cultural heritage collections are likely to have materials governed by FERPA requirements, which concern the privacy of an individual's educational records. Lastly, archives hold many other valuable cultural heritage materials that contain personally identifiable information, such as social security numbers and addresses. These materials are at an escalated risk of loss. Our case studies have confirmed that it's common practice for archives to refuse any data that contains PHI or PII, regardless of its historical, evidential, or research value, predominantly because they don't have the means to steward it or the resources to manage it. Beyond the main project partners and IMLS, we've been very grateful for the support and participation of the more than a dozen institutions shown on the slide. These partners have, among other things, helped us collect use cases for private and sensitive data preservation and have helped surface the technical, legal, and service model needs and challenges. We also have key data center partners which can help provide the technical infrastructure for a sensitive data network. For example, the Texas Advanced Computing Center, TAC, at UT Austin has partnered with TDL on several projects over the years and already has a HIPAA compliant data storage service. Similarly, the San Diego Supercomputer Center, or SDSC, provides HIPAA compliant storage to its faculty and researchers at UCSD. And both computing centers have shared with us their expertise in providing this type of storage, including details of their services and related costs. One of the things from the get-go was that the project team hypothesized that the bar set by HIPAA requirements is sufficiently high to protect many other kinds of non-regulated sensitive data, so like PII and FERPA materials. So based on that bar, what we're really looking at is what it takes to provide a HIPAA compliant DDP network. And I would like to mention that we are deliberately excluding classified and top secret data, which has additional considerations surrounding it. So we started working on the grant last summer by hiring our graduate research assistant, Hassam Andalib. Hassam hit the ground running and gathered a number of use cases and outlined the agreements between all of the parties in the Chronopolis network. We then met with our partners in Austin last December, back when traveling and meeting people in person was still feasible. We gathered some really valuable information from our partners during that meeting. Since then, we've worked to determine gaps in our current agreement and processes that we need to address to satisfy the requirements of private and sensitive data. And we've also investigated service and cost models. And lastly, we'll be disseminating our findings at the end of the grant term, which is quickly coming up. So this illustration shows the legal connections which are currently necessary to sustain the Chronopolis DDP network. As you can see, there are many connections which require legal agreements of various kinds, such as SLAs, MOUs, etc. We need to update the majority of these agreements to what in HIPAA terminology is known as a business associate agreement, or BAA. In some cases, this may be relatively straightforward. For example, the University of California has a stock BAA agreement, and Amazon offers one as well. However, other organizations don't necessarily have one in place, and even if they did so, there would need to be the proper authority to execute such an agreement, and that authority might not reside within the library. Over the course of our work this year, we've been considering kind of how to overlay our existing network with the HIPAA compliant one. And this is kind of what you're looking at here. We want to be able to accommodate kind of a subset of the sensitive data without disrupting our regular service or undermining compliance to HIPAA as the gold standard. And as I've mentioned before, currently SDSC and TAC are the two compliant nodes that we've identified. So we would need to fully form the DDP network with a minimum of 3 distributed nodes. We would need to identify a third node. And we'd also need considerably more documentation as well as the changes to the legal agreements that I mentioned previously. So one of the tasks in this planning grant was really to identify kind of service models for providing preservation storage for sensitive data. And as I mentioned, both UCSD and TDL could actually provide kind of a single node HIPAA compliant service. Basically by leveraging our existing partners with SDSC and TAC. And we do recognize that this is not, a true distributed digital network preservation network. The depositors in this case would have to leverage local storage and also ideally an additional storage point to actually get that geographical distribution that is desirable. And also have to manage and coordinate all 3 of those copies. But this would be the least costly option as it only really relies on one storage node. A fully HIPAA compliant 3-node DDP service model would be the most complex and also the most costly of the options we've discussed. And as I said, we would need to identify the third node that could provide HIPAA compliant digital preservation storage. The other tricky thing about this particular node, particular offering, is that there's differences in cost between the UCSD and TAC node, and probably a different way of costing things for whichever third node that would sign on. And so all of that would have to kind of be leveraged and determined and figured out. Another option that we kind of discussed was creating a HIPAA-like DDP network. So it meets all of the requirements, but isn't necessarily audited and certified as HIPAA compliant. In the HIPAA universe, this is known as being HIPAA eligible. So it kind of abides by all of the security and technical requirements of a HIPAA compliant network, but is not actually considered HIPAA compliant, predominantly because of the auditing that is not taking place. And the auditing is actually quite expensive. This would also serve the needs of many of the partners that we've kind of worked with who aren't actually accepting HIPAA data into their collections, but have sensitive data with FERPA or PII in it that they do want additional security around. And in a very informal poll of our project participants, this actually turned out to be the most appealing option of the ones that we've listed, including the two that I've just discussed, the single node and the single compliant node and the fully compliant network. So that suggests that it's really worth exploring more. There's other things to consider when thinking about how to move ahead with our different service provisions. The first is the question of whether there's actually enough HIPAA covered data, which is at a state in its digital preservation life cycle to move into digital preservation storage. Is there a quorum, a large enough quantity of this data to cover the cost really of the network starting? And is it, or even be enough to justify such a service? Along with that, what resources do potential service providers have available to them to engage legal advisors, compliance officers, security expertise, developers, technical documentation writers, etc.? And finally, many of the institutions we spoke throughout the course of the past year aren't even engaged in regular distributed digital preservation networks for their non-sensitive data. And a lot of that is just not being ready to deposit the data. So do they need additional training, et cetera, additional resources to get the materials in a space necessary, or in the space necessary to then deposit into a preservation system? And even at that point, would they have the ability to have additional training for HIPAA and FERPA compliance, et cetera? So basically, how do we get the depositors in a state of readiness to take advantage of such a service offering? So with all this in mind, where do we go from here? One approach that seems to make sense is really to start with one node offering and grow from there, gradually increasing nodes and geographical diversity, and also, getting a feel of, how much data there is and how likely uptake of the service would be. And as a community of digital preservation practitioners, we also need to take a big step back and consider how to properly prepare institutions to acquire private and sensitive data. Readiness is still a massive massive problem even in regular digital preservation. So we'll continue to share information and start discussions whenever we can. And we want to hear more from you, especially if you have additional use cases or would like to be involved in future projects related to this topic. Please do stay in touch with us, and we'll let you know when we have completed our project report. We will make that publicly available. If you have any questions, here's where you can reach us. We do have a documentation, a wiki full of our documentation, including our use cases, legal binds, etc. Also provided on the slide is the IMLS grant summary and narrative. And thank you very much.